Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben, and I'm here on behalf of the Hospital Research Foundation group Arthritis. And I'd like to welcome everyone again to another one of our webinars. Tonight's a really exciting one. It's called Exercise the First Steps with Matthew Beard. First and foremost, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. Both me and Matthew today present from Ghana land, and would like to extend our welcome to any elders here today and any elders past, present and future. This webinar has actually been made possible through funding from the Country South Australia Primary Health Network. And I'd first and foremost really like to remind everyone that there is a question and answers at the end that Matthew will be going through. And that question and answer function is open for the entire presentation. Now, our presenter tonight is Mr. Matthew Beard, and he's a physiotherapist with over 30 years of experience. And he also does a lot of research with extensive experience and interest in the field of arthritis. And before becoming a physio, Matthew was actually a scientist. And he'll go on a little bit about that and kind of talking a lot more about the science and explanations behind a lot of his recommendations tonight. Matthew's career has really focused in supporting individuals living with a variety of arthritic conditions, and he splits his time between both private practice and a public hospital role as a team lead. So I welcome you tonight, Matthew.
Ben, thank you very much. Welcome to all the audience. I do appreciate those in South Australia on this cold and miserable evening. Hopefully we can add a bit of colour to the evening. And thank you, Ben, Hospital Research Foundation, Country Health Network, for supporting this. Now, I'm trying to keep it nice and lighthearted. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, but I think the really important message before I even start is this is all about the audience. This is not about me. So let's direct the whole of the evening back to the audience and potentially empowering them. Now I'll begin with the first slide. Let's begin. I'm going to cover a little bit of background, and then importantly, because we all need to consider, regardless of what an intervention is, whether it's something major like surgery or pharmacotherapy or something like exercise, that we got to consider the risks, the risk of the arthritis population, and then the risks of the intervention, and what the benefits potentially are to you. So you consider the balance. I then might address the question of why me. That is why a member of the audience. The easiest thing to do is to do nothing, but why don't we turn that around and say, why me? How to get started and what might be some handy hints. Now, I think the really important slide and where to begin from is that when we hear about exercise, whether we look at the media or read the paper or spend any time on YouTube or the like, there's always the thought that it's very intense and demanding. What I'm talking about today, it all relates to the audience and does not involve any of these illustrations here. So we need to decouple professional sport. We need to uncouple elite activities and intense exercise. We're looking at something entirely different, and that will lead into my next slide. The concept that I want you all to consider tonight is using exercise as medicine. And this is now becoming a sort of a new narrative with a number of the physicians involved in the care of patients in the context of managing their arthritis, regardless of what type of arthritis. GPs are beginning to talk about it. But this concept of exercise as medicine, we think is new, but in fact, it was first described 400 years BC by probably the very first of all physicians, Hippocrates. So maybe it's not as new as we'd like to believe, but we're having to relearn some of the old messages. I'll lead into what I really mean as exercise as medicine. So let's begin sort of on a very, very serious note. And think of the population now, whether this is osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, of which they're underneath that umbrella, they're dozens and dozens of different conditions. There is no doubt that surveys will show that the risk of heart disease or even cardiovascular disease, so it's heart disease and stroke, is considerably elevated regardless of the type of arthritis you have. And there are a number of reasons why that's so, and I don't really need to go into them now, other than the fact that we know that if you compare a group of people that have arthritis, and it doesn't matter what type, versus a group of people the same age, same gender, same age, weight and height, unfortunately the arthritis group has a much, much higher risk of heart disease. So in any discussion about arthritis, you've got to think about your heart health. So that's, I think, one thing that we need to consider before we start this conversation of what are the first steps. Believe it or not, as arthritis progresses, there are even more risks, and I may be discussing the more obvious ones. And there's no doubt your walking and walking gait, interchangeable, tends to slow. And believe it or not, that has health implications the slower you walk. There's no doubt your step length, how far you step out, diminishes, and that may seem a long way away from what you thought I'd be talking about, but it does in turn lead to an elevated falls risk. And if you combine that with maybe bones that aren't quite as durable as when you were younger, this can elevate your fracture risk. So there are all sorts of reasons why we consider that there's an inherent risk with arthritis and falls and your heart health, not just your joint health, that we may need to consider in the context of why exercise and what exercise. Now, if just in general, so we're just parking for one moment the thought of arthritis and that affects all of us in the audience. But if we think about the benefits of exercise per se to the population, there's no doubt that people that exercise regularly, their risk of diabetes is diminished, which is tremendous. The risk of heart disease is diminished. It's not in any way undermining the impact of medication in those two, but it does decrease risk. Certain exercises, not all exercises, will improve your bone strength. And that's why exercise, in fact, is quite condition and task specific. We're not all robots, and in the same way, not all exercise is equally beneficial. There's no doubt from a mental health point of view, and that's very much in the contemporary narrative, it is a powerful tool. There was a publication earlier this year regarding its role for depression and anxiety, and it is effective and something that you need to consider. It better helps you cope with stress. And there's no doubt there's certain cancers, not all cancers, but certain cancers for people that regularly exercise, their risk is diminished. You might note that in a general term, I haven't in any way incorporated the word, weight optimization or weight loss there, because it's one thing that's one of the great myths that's peddled through the media, that there are great benefits of regular exercise, but as a tool on its own to lose weight, it's incredibly ineffective. The volumes of exercise you have to do to get any meaningful change is prodigious. And so, people often say, well, I exercise and I didn't change my weight. Well, the reason is that the amount you have to do is vast. And so I think it's important that we don't have that on the list of benefits, and it really should be. There are other strategies that you might consider, and that's probably not for this evening. Now, I think we need, again, to put our focus, because I'm sure there are plenty of people in the audience that have horror stories about exercise. I hope that, I made things a little less confronting by saying we're taking elite and intense exercise off the table this evening. But if we look at the context of, does exercise per se, like walking or jogging, damage an arthritic knee? There actually have been some sequential MR studies. So MRI is the gold standard when it comes to trying to look at structure of the knee in particular. And these studies were done sequentially, where they did a scan at baseline and then applied exercise, and it was quite high intensity exercise, and then continued to rescan the knee in the context of a knee that was already arthritic. And there's no doubt that exercise does not hasten knee arthritis. So I think, that's important. It may change symptoms, yes, but it doesn't destroy the knee joint, which is important in the context of tonight's discussion. Now, I think what we're trying to say is we're discussing exercise as medicine, not exercise to run marathons or win the Tour de France. And it is an immensely powerful pill if it's done regularly and appropriately. And there's no doubt that I've cited another study here where they're looking at not osteoarthritis, but one of the inflammatory arthritises, which fit under the umbrella of sort of rheumatoid arthritis. And there's no doubt that a program over 3 months of quite high intensity exercise for this particular group showed that there was less pain and stiffness. They were less fatigued. Most importantly, and this is the one that's relevant for everyone in the audience, is function. What couldn't you do that you can do today? Because there's no doubt that arthritis can control and dictate function, and that's where we need to focus our attention, both as clinicians and as patients, rather than necessary strength or movement. It's function, what you can't do today that you'd like to do tomorrow. Of course, cardiovascular health, as I said, this is a group that are at high risk of cardiovascular disease, and for this particular inflammatory arthritis, it improved a number of their bloods in the context of inflammatory markers. So, it's not a panacea, but it does have some quite profound effects, and that's why I suggest that potentially used appropriately, it's a powerful pill that you need to potentially consider without the risk of some other things. There's no doubt also, if we look at groups, there's a program, it's an international program, originated in Denmark, called GLAD, that many of you would have heard of. Good Living with Osteoarthritis Denmark is actually what GLAD stands for. It's not wrap that you use to cover dinner. And there's no doubt the supervised regimen that the GLAD and the team, and as I say, it's an international team, in a group setting, and in particular in the context of knee arthritis, has shown some good improvements with regard to pain control and function. And there's no doubt the results are sustained in the long term. So again, not a magic panacea, and I'm not suggesting that it's the only way to manage knee arthritis, but it's something to consider when, as a patient or as a client, you're trying to balance benefits for yourself versus the risks, because that's always the equation that you should ask yourself when discussing maybe with your GP, what are the best options for you. So I'm going to turn this around, and I think the hard thing is clinicians can always seem quite solemn, and sometimes the science can be a bit dry. But I need you all to think about the fact that I can present endless trials that are a compelling reason why you should consider it, and trials to show that the risks of not doing exercise. But I'd always hate my patient to walk out the door and say, well, I'm doing this because Matthew said it was a good idea, because that's actually a very bad reason. We need to turn it around and say, well, what's important to you as the patient? Because that is the most important driver. Why me? And the way we can best consider where exercise may fit into our arthritis care, and it might be a small piece of the puzzle, it might be a large piece of the puzzle. There may be other things that you and your GP are considering, is that the goal needs to be yours and not mine. And, one way to turn this around is to say that we do know that arthritis impacts on function. You know, sometimes it gets so bad that it seems to control your life. But a good way of considering where it fits in is, where do you want to be in 6 months' time? And the reason I pop these variety of illustrations up here is that we all have different interests and passions, and we don't want arthritis to dictate what we do or don't do. You need to turn around and say, well, what may I do? How might exercise help me enjoy my fishing or my tapestry, enjoy time with grandkids or kids, enjoy a walk with friends, or go camping? I think the things that interest you and not me should be used as the principal driver as why exercise might be an important piece of the puzzle in your arthritis care. Now, there's no doubt that GPs are very important. You and the GP might be the two most important clinician and patient in your total arthritis management. But there's no doubt for those that maybe haven't exercised for a long time or at all, that there's certain conditions that it's probably worth having a screen before you start, just from a risk management safety point of view. And there's no doubt if you've got heart disease, especially if it's not well managed or it's unstable, a review with the GP is an important step. You know, if you get acute chest pain that's related to the heart disease, that's very, very important. You get that sorted out before we begin. Diabetes itself is not a contraindication, but at the same time, its stability and whether it's well managed by your GP and yourself is important before you embark upon even a very modest program. If your blood pressure, hypertension, I think it's important that connected to your heart health, we need to know where that is, because there's no doubt exercise can help managing hypertension, but if it's unstable and it's high, I would suggest that your GP or cardiologist is the most important two clinicians in that discussion before someone like myself. And there's no doubt in the context of load on your joint or respiratory disease related to smoking, it may well be worth understanding your status before you embark upon a program, and a discussion with the GP is entirely appropriate. You know, there are a whole lot of screening tools. Some of them are quite simple and some of them are more advanced to check up on your heart health that some of the international guidelines suggest you have done, but you know, I wouldn't ever want to use them as an impediment to starting, but it's important at least to have the discussion in the first stage with your doctor if any of those conditions are present. Now, the quote, I think, reflects the fact that for any of us, if we're embarking upon exercise as medicine, the first step is really hard. And even if it is a very modest, tiny first step, I think we never need to underestimate the fact that it is difficult and it is hard. I think just using the reasons that I stated as all the medical reasons, I think is a bad reason to start. I think you need to set a goal, and the goal needs to be where you want to be in 6 or 12 months' time, where you want to be in 10 years' time. And that's where exercise best fits in. You know, there's no doubt you and your GP might decide to take some bloods, or you might decide to check your blood pressure, your blood sugar, as parameters of how the exercise is helping in a positive way. But the goal, I think, should be a functional one, and it should be your goal, not mine. The next, of course, that I always hear from patients, they don't have enough time. Everyone's busy, but just remember, in a week, you've got 168 hours to play with. And, you know, there are a number of things that are non-negotiable regarding sleep and work and eating and family and friends. But there is still time available, discretionary time. And I think when you're investing in your health, it's critical. It might be the first step is a very, very modest allocation of time. If you do a Google search, there are both American and Australian guidelines that suggest that you should be allocating 30 minutes on most days of the week. But for some people, that's a huge step. That's a mountain. So it might be that the first step is 5 minutes on alternate days, and that's fine. I think the activity to begin with doesn't really matter. You have to enjoy it. There's no point in hearing that, oh well, Pilates is the answer, or yoga is the answer, or Tai Chi. If you don't enjoy those activities, it's most unlikely that you'll continue them. So I think the activity needs to be something that relates and resonates with you, and it also probably needs to consider, one, where your health and your physical fitness is today. And it might be that you begin your exercise routine in a chair, and that's fine. So it has to be manageable, but it also has to be of interest to you. There's nothing worse than doing something you don't enjoy. There are a variety of ways to actually improve compliance, that is, improve the likelihood of you still doing it in 6 months' time. And some of them are quite surprising. Exercising before lunch, you're more likely to stick with, believe it or not, than if you try exercising in the afternoon or evening. Now, some people, their lifestyle will only allow them to have a little program in the evening, and that's fine. It's just that the research shows us that you're more likely to stick with something before lunch than after. There's no doubt you've got to enjoy the activity. And when I say involve a friend, it's very, very tough trying to be disciplined and be a lone wolf. For some of us, that's fine. And for some of us, that's the only option we have. But the minute that you get a friend involved as well, you're far more likely to stick with it. And that friend might be four-legged and furry. And there's no doubt there's some quite interesting trials that have shown that if someone starts a walking program, if they happen to be walking with their dog, they're far more likely to be doing it in 6 months than if they're not. So, as I said, the friend can take all sorts of forms, but it's often important, and it can make it enjoyable, because it's not meant to be a sentence, and it's not meant to be punishing. And I think the important thing as well is, once you've got the all clear from the GP, if that's appropriate, it's so easy to put this off to tomorrow or next week or next month. But if you want to be doing something interesting at the end of the year that is difficult or impossible at the moment, you have got to start today. And it might be a tiny step, it might be on alternate days, but I think if you leave it for tomorrow or the day after, it's often hard to get going. Now, I've put two extremes here. I mean, walking is free and for most of us, and simple and easy to evolve. It's great for your joints, but it's also an aerobic exercise, so it's good for your heart and lung health. But it's so important that the first steps are very modest, and it doesn't matter if it seems incredibly easy to begin with. It's far better to start at a very low base and then over time build up. If you're going to do chair-based exercises, exactly the same metric applies. There's nothing more likely to discourage you from continuing if you start fast and intense. It's no fun, and it's likely to have you stopping very, very quickly. And I think that's important. So baby steps to begin with, and slow ones are the way to go. It's interesting that people often talk about how hard you have to go, and do I need to wear a heart rate monitor, and there are all sorts of measures of exertion, how much huff and puff. But the funny thing about exercise is there's no doubt we know that it's not good to do no exercise, but it's not a linear relationship, in that the more you do, the better you get. It becomes at the top end a case of diminishing returns, which means that, yes, there are benefits at the low end. As you do a bit more, you'll get more and more benefits. But doing huge amounts don't continue to improve the benefits. So that's why I think in the context of not worrying about a heart rate monitor, but regardless of what exercise, whether it's a chair-based exercise or not, whether it's in the pool or on land, whether it's walking on an exercise bike, a row machine, it really doesn't matter. The conversation exercise in the context of most of our health, regardless of whether you've got diabetes or heart disease, regardless of whether you're on a whole lot of cardiac medication that may actually limit how much, or at least the maximum your heart can beat at, the conversation index is a safe and appropriate tool. And it basically means if you've got that friend there and you can talk to them, you're exercising at the right intensity. If you're going so quickly or the load is so high that you're having to say, well, just hang on a minute before I catch my breath and then I'll respond to you, you're going a bit hard. So save all the fancy equipment of monitoring your heart rate. If you can talk and walk, or you can talk and exercise, or talk and swim in the pool, with a group class doing water exercise, that's about right. Balancing safety for you at low risk. Now, how far, and I've probably got this lovely shot of the road disappearing amongst the trees. It's important to get into the routine, and a little and often is far better than thinking, well, if I just do a lot on Monday, it'll be good for the rest of the week. And by and large, that's not true. It's better than doing nothing, but it's far, far better to have a regular routine, even if it's to begin on alternate days or twice a week to begin with. And regardless of whether it's resistance, that is load, or time, or pace, once you get settled into a program that's comfortable and you're comfortable doing the exercise, and that evening and the following day you feel relatively comfortable, you may want to progress things. And the 10% rule means that basically, if you want to progress, don't suddenly double what you're doing. If you add 10%, so if you walk for 10 minutes and the increment is 1 minute, not 10. If you've lifted 10 kilograms, the next time you lift a weight, aim for 11. By and large, the body can absorb those small changes in load or time or resistance or pace. But if you try and progress faster than that, often there is a downside, and that's what you want to avoid. So if you're happy doing a particular volume of exercise, that's fine. But if you want to progress, applying the 10% rule, again, a bit like my conversation index, it is a safe way to go. I mean, these days we have so much technology that's either on our wrist or in our pocket. The question then is, can I use that, and can I use that efficiently? And there's no doubt, pedometers have been around for a very long time, and they're relatively inexpensive. But most phones that you have will have apps that are available that are free that will monitor steps, both when you go for a walk or incidental steps around home or during the day. And I'm not suggesting you should slavishly be looking at your daily step count and trying to compete, but it does often give you a baseline in that saying, well, this is where I've begun. And then a month or two later, you might monitor for a couple of days and say, well, it looks like I've increased my volume and load. So it might be a useful tool in the context of where you want to be in 6 months' time as a goal, but I wouldn't use it every day, because they can, I think often be quite unhelpful in the context of what we're trying to do. I mean, smartwatches as well are another option you have of often measuring the amount of time that you're walking, or the average step count per day. But as I say, I think having a snapshot at periods of time rather than having it dictate what you're doing every day is a better approach. Now, I deliberately didn't want to go on too long, because I think having a little grab bag of ideas regarding how to get started, having a goal, engaging with a friend, making sure it's an activity that you enjoy, and then starting very, very modestly, having a look at your timetable and saying, well, I could fit in a few minutes on Tuesday and Thursday, and that's all to begin with, and that might be fine for a month, and then review it after then. I think please don't set the bar too high, because of course that often guarantees failure. If you need help, of course, I've got the Arthritis Foundation. I know they have a number of resources when it comes to group settings, both on land and water. Believe it or not, local councils, especially if you ask, often have exercise groups that are available. If you find that, in the context of what you want to do, it's nice to have people around. There are a couple of other websites, both Walking SA and the Heart Foundation, that have links to a whole range of walking groups. So if you want to progress a program on, there's no reason. I'm not a great advocate of, people like gyms, that's fine, but I'd far prefer them looking at exercise that they enjoy, one, and is relatively inexpensive if there's any cost at all. I think there are enough pressures on our budgets at the moment without adding to them further, and you wouldn't want also that to be an impediment to getting a start. So there's some useful resources. I'm sure Ben, if queries do come in, will provide some others, but they're worth having a link. Now, Ben, I might give the audience a chance to digest some of that material, and maybe some questions could be thrown up that we might discuss with the whole group.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. That was really, really good. It's fantastic hearing someone with your expertise, really break it down into such both detail and such an understandable way. It's fantastic. So we do have a few questions which have come in already. The first one we've got is someone asking, who's really the best person after GP says it's all right to go, if you want to start that exercise journey with like an exercise professional? Who would you recommend are kind of the best people to seek out with that?
Okay. It's a very good question, because we're not robots, in that what suits, say, me and what suits Ben with regard to our exercise journey will be quite different. And I'd always want a clinician, and I'll get on to the answer to that, who provided me with some guidance as to, in the context of your arthritis and your other medical conditions, A, B, and C is appropriate. I'm not 18, and I'm not trying to get drafted into the Crows or the Power. So there are no doubt there's some of my colleagues who have that skill set, but there are no doubt another group that I would potentially put ahead of us, which are the exercise physiologists. There's a third group I haven't mentioned, and they're the trainers who often, the personal trainers that come, with gyms or boot camps alike. And there's no doubt they have a wonderful understanding of gym equipment and exercise programs. But if you remember my first slide of the three groups of people, one using the heavy rope, the other one lifting a very heavy weight over their head, and the third group that were doing one-handed push-ups, that's not where you want to start. And there's no doubt I've had a number of patients who've come to see me who have had trainers who have, I think, not considered the client or the patient, not considered their age, their priorities, their fitness, and their medical condition, and then have prescribed something that is far, far too intense and too demanding. And it hasn't ended well for for the client. And I think that's the thing that you need to be so careful of, that, you know, generic programs are cheap and inappropriate. What suits Ben and I is going to be very different. What suits you and the audience is different. So I think of the two clinicians group, maybe an exercise physiologist or a physio with an interest in the area are two people to consider. And then there are ways to potentially access that. If it's not through the public sector, there are a number of NGOs that provide it, and of course GPs can initiate, if appropriate, things called an EPC, which is some supported sessions through either of those cohorts that are funded by the Department of Health and Cameron. But I think what you're trying to do is, as a client, is ask the question, what's best for me, not just, I don't want a generic program. And then what tools can I take also home? Because, doing something with them once a week over the 3 or 5 sessions you get a year is not going to cut mustard. If you could spread them over a year and then review things periodically, but have a program you can do in the confines of your environment or your community, is the way I'd approach it.
Really good answer to that. I'll add as well, just another question's popped up for me. So say someone is like going to join one of those gyms or something like that, or joining, maybe another exercise class from a community group or something. Are there any tips you can give them when they first arrive? Are there ways to try and measure, is this class going to be appropriate, rather than having that harm?
Regardless of how fit and strong you are, I'd always begin at a beginner's class. And the only thing probably, rather than saying you can't do A, B, C, or D, it's just that the high impact exercises. So, the jumping and the sprinting, the deep squats with a huge weight on the back. I'm not sure the benefits there are all that great, and I think the risks are quite considerable. So there are no particular exercises that I'd rule out. But if you were starting with a group session, I'd aim very low, and even if it seems like for you it's quite easy, it's better to do that than aim a bit high and then find that you're miserable for the next few days. And the other thing I think you should always be comfortable, and it relates back to the fact that none of us are robots, and there may be certain exercises that if I try that, it's just not going to work, or it's going to hurt. If you're in a group class, I think it's very important that you're confident to say, this one's not for me. I'll stand this one out, or instead of doing 10 repetitions, I might do 1 and see how I go. So be very aware that physiologically we change with arthritis, we change with age, and just because someone else in the class seems a bit older and frail and is doing them easily, it doesn't mean that you have to or should do. Be confident to be able to say no, I suppose, is the take-home message.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And I think something that people should be aware of all the time, I guess, is how I always put it, talking to people with arthritis, is, you've got to put yourself first and always be aware that you come first with these things, and never go along with something that might harm you.
No.
We've got someone asking about research. So they say that they're well aware that research has really shown that osteoarthritis doesn't get worse with exercise, especially knee and hip osteoarthritis. And they're asking more specifically if it's including mild and mid-foot osteoarthritis could get worse from exercise. They're saying that they've asked a couple of their exercise professionals and they're not too sure. They say it might not be an easy one, but just wondering about that, if foot arthritis could be worse from exercise.
Okay. Look, a very good question. It's important to realize that, all sorts of exercises done inappropriately or at high intensity can change your symptoms. That is, you may get more pain or you may get swelling. Just because you've got more pain, it doesn't mean that the actual joint surfaces, the bearing surfaces, have changed. And in the context of that research that I had put up earlier, there's no doubt for the knee, the exercises I've been talking about will not damage the knee. Has there been a separate study on the ankle? No, there hasn't. And so I suppose you could turn that around. What are the important things that you need to consider? Well, it's actually managing load. And people then say, well, what ways can I manage load? I can either make the joint stronger, and the only thing that we can change is the muscles that surround the joint, or we can decrease the load on the joint, and that's potentially changing the body mass. In the context of ankle arthritis, where I don't have those studies that I can present to the person in the audience today, I would suggest that the really, really important things are, number one, footwear. Is that the footwear, there's no perfect brand of footwear. The footwear that's right for you is the stuff that you feel comfortable, and it's not related to brand and it's not related to price, it's just related to comfort, number one. And two, and I think an appropriate step may be that if ankle pain is the primary problem, then to begin exercise might be, well, how can I unload the ankle and the foot so I can still do the exercise, but I'm not miserable that night? And that may be being sensible with regard to the prescription. So it might be, well, how can we unload the ankle? Now, one way we can unload it is, of course, doing things with reduced weight bearing. So that could be sitting. You can still do resistance exercise sitting with things like rubber bands and the like. Or you can, if it was appropriate and it's something which there's no doubt the minute you get into the pool and standing in about chest depth water, you're only getting 60% of your body weight or less. It might be as low as 40% going through the ankle. So there's a way you can unload the joint but still exercise it. And another way is using devices like an exercise bike, or even the pedals that you can set up in front of a chair. So in that way, you've been a bit clever about it, saying, I want to exercise my ankle, but I don't want to load it in such a way that it either is swollen or painful. Being clever about the prescription and saying, well, there's different ways that we can provide exercise that don't involve putting your full body weight through the ankle, is what I would make sure was a part of a program.
Perfect. Really good answer to that one. Explained it really well. You mentioned this, and someone's got a question that follows on quite well from that. They're asking, what's your opinion on cycling and non-weight bearing exercise in arthritis?
Okay. So long the audience member is not wanting to win the Tour de France, I love, so I ride a bike, but I prescribe for a huge number of my patients the use of stationary bikes or pedals on the floor. But I'd be the first to admit, and this is coming from a cyclist, that it's not the most exciting thing. So you need to turn it around in that rather than spending hours and hours on the bike, having something happening at the same time, and that might be music you love or Netflix that you're currently binging upon. So you link an activity that you enjoy with your cycling. Don't put the news on, because that's never all that much fun. And again, you can vary. So, you might begin doing just 3-minute segments very gently at a very steady pace with the seat up fairly high, so the load on your hip and your knee is not too great. And then you can either extend the time, or you can change the pace intermittently, or gently you can increase the load. I think it's very important, and a real mistake made with exercise bikes and the like is to have the resistance turned up too high, because that tends to load up the knee in a way that's unhelpful. But with regard to what benefits that it provides, it's a lovely way with reduced weight bearing to exercise the ankle, which was the question we received previously. It puts the knee through a lovely range of movement under reduced load, which is great, and the hip. And the other great dividend about bikes is that at the same time as looking after your joints, it's providing a gentle aerobic load for your heart and lungs. So you're getting a cardiovascular heart health benefit plus a joint benefit. And not all exercises do that as succinctly as a bike does. And the lovely thing about a bike, you can have it at home. You don't have to spend lots of money, so long the seat is height adjustable and it's comfortable, so long the resistance can be adjusted up or down to suit you. And as I say, I'd start right down at a 1 or 2 or 2 or 3 out of 10 resistance to begin with. They're bikes with the most complicated interfaces now that cost a fortune and frankly are unnecessary and are not going to offer you any benefit over and above the simple no frills model.
Perfect. So it sounds like it's a very, very good option, very positive in your rankings of, well, not rankings of exercise, but your opinion of them.
Definitely. And if you can do it at home, you know, you don't have to worry about the weather. You don't have to worry about gym or pool membership. You know, you can have a friend there, and if you enjoy music or you're watching something, you can combine the two. And that's maybe taking some of the challenging, boring aspect away from exercise, because you can link something that's fun with something that's great for your heart and your knees. And that seems to me to tick a number of boxes. It's just important not to, as I say, think that you're going to win the Tour de France on day one, because that's not the right approach.
Perfect. We get some interesting questions, I know, at head office and talking to a lot of people with arthritis who sometimes get a bit confused, and they've got especially hand osteoarthritis, and they get quite concerned when we say, well, you need to keep exercising, and they kind of go, well, what does that mean for my hands? You know, what are hand exercises? Is it just squeezing tennis balls and things like that? Can you comment on that a little bit professionally and kind of demystify that idea a little bit?
Yep. There is no doubt that osteoarthritis in the hand can be terribly, terribly disabling. You know, it's uncomfortable, and all of a sudden, a whole lot of things in your day-to-day that once upon a time were easy and you didn't think about become challenging. Jars and doorknobs and taps. I mean, the list is endless. In the context of exercise, there are some other simple conservative interventions I probably won't go into, but in the context of exercise, hands are quite complicated in that, yes, we consider all the joints, and the joints may over time stiffen up and they can become deformed. But the real challenge with regard to function, and that's what I was talking about with day-to-day activity, is that the muscles, not only in the forearm that power some of the part of the hand, but also the muscles within the hand itself can diminish, they can waste. And it's that loss of power with pain that makes, you know, opening a jar or closing a hot water tap so challenging when once it wasn't. Exercising the hand is actually quite tricky, and rather than feeling like you've just got to be squeezing a tennis ball or a squash ball, there's one very simple intervention that's like a mobile gym for the hand. There's a therapeutic device, a silicon putty, that's very much like Play-Doh, but you can actually use Play-Doh, even though, because it's much, much cheaper and it does exactly the same job. So the reason I suggest that in the context of managing hand osteoarthritis is it's possible to roll up some of this putty or Play-Doh the size of about a squash ball, no larger. And then the combination of the heat of your hand and gentle pressure, of course, will change the shape of the ball, and it'll then squeeze through the fingers. You can then progress that to you attempting to cut the Play-Doh, if you roll it up like a sausage rather than a ball and then place it between fingers and try and draw your fingers together, there's a very, very clever and simple way of exercising all the important intrinsic muscles of the hand. Now that may be combined with people that have very severe hand arthritis might use splints, but when the splint is off, there's a safe way to exercise them. Some people with arthritis find isotoner gloves, which are a material that's a combination of lycra and spandex, so that they're very tight, form-fitting gloves, that they may use that in part to control swelling and in part to help with comfort. So I've mentioned splints and the gloves, and then a supplement to exercise is, as I say, the either silicone putty, or if you want to save lots of money, Play-Doh, which works just as well. And then to avoid it drying out, I tell my patients, because I like to use things that are in the house that are cheap and simple to access, and then pop it in a Ziploc bag so it doesn't dry out, and then you can leave it. And you might begin doing it for a couple of, even a minute in each hand as a start, see how the hands respond. And that could be a sort of your mobile gym for the hand. Very simple, very inexpensive, and it works beautifully in focusing on your intrinsic muscles. They are the muscles of the hand.
Perfect. That's fantastic advice, and thank you very much for that, Matthew. That's it. We've got questions from attendees today. Is there anything else you'd like to say, Matthew, or happy to wrap it up if you'd like?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you all for switching on in this cold and miserable night. At least what I hope to have done today is start a conversation. And the conversation is, in the context of managing arthritis in the long term, the benefits far outweigh the risks, but it's important that you customize the program. And customize means do something you enjoy, do it regularly, plus or minus with a friend. Don't do it because of me, do it because something that you want to be doing in December 2023 or next year. And that will be far, far more motivating than listening to me, even at my best. So with those things in mind, beginning with a baby step, but being regular, I do hope that, of course, and you'll find this unusual, a lot of clinicians want to sort of link their patients up for life. But if I can give my patients the skills that they can re-engage with things that they enjoy, and I become redundant, I've done a great job. So hopefully you can think about exercise, enjoy what you want to be doing in December, and the likes of me, I mean, we're always here, but there are plenty of other resources. Ben will be able to tap you onto some, and I've given you a couple of leads to potentially consider if the council or walking groups are something that interests you. But thank you all, and very best wishes for the remainder of 2023.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Matthew, and everyone who's attending. I appreciate it very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your night.